Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I mentioned this op-ed in the National Post, Canadian newspaper, a couple weeks ago. Kelly McParlin talking about the left and how the left has disconnected itself from regular people. Too busy saving the world are the leftists to bother with your mundane everyday problems or the consequences of what they propose, what they advocate. And this manifests itself in so many respects, including with respect to trans rights, the trans rights movement. This piece in Colette.com, Marcus Evans, he's a psychoanalyst in private practice, formerly served as a consultant psychotherapist and associate clinical director of adult and adolescent studies at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust in Britain, National Health Service Trust in Britain. Why I resigned from Tavistock. Trans-identified children need therapy, not just affirmation and drugs. Over the past 5 years, there's been a 400% rise in referrals to the Tavistock Centre in North London, the only NHS clinic in Britain that treats children with gender identity developmental issues. We do not fully understand what's going on in this complex area, and it's essential to examine the phenomenon systematically and objectively, but this has become difficult in the current environment as debate is continually being closed down amid accusations of transphobia. The de facto censorship is harming children. During the 90s, I assessed adult parasuicides, apparent suicide attempts or suicidal gestures. A number of my patients had gone through gender reassignment surgery and often were angry at the loss of their biological sexual functioning. They also were aggrieved with psychiatric professionals who they believed had failed to adequately investigate the underlying psychological difficulties associated with gender dysphoria. As a psychotherapist, I consult with various mental health services that manage patients exhibiting challenging behaviors. He talks about his observations with these patients. And then he goes to work at this Tavistock and Portman clinic. Again, it's a public facility available to everyone. It's the only clinic that serves children with these identity issues. And he sees parents expressing concerns about how their children are being handled, fast-tracked for developmental services like reassignment without any serious psychological evaluation. A mother of a group representing parents wrote to me in my role as governor of this facility, on the Board of Governors. He replied and circulated copies of that reply to other governors, but the debate has been shut down. And those raising concerns, there's been an effort among colleagues to discredit them professionally. And so he resigned from the Board of Governors of this medical facility in London. Harming children. We don't fully understand what's going on, but we're going to go at breakneck pace to say a 4-year-old a girl who thinks she's a boy, well, let's get her under the knife. And this, of course, is the case in media as well. A story comes to us from the Free Beacon. Denver Post columnist says he was fired for saying that there are two sexes and only two sexes. There are only two sexes identified by an XX or XY chromosome. That is the very definition of binary. The AP ruling, saying that sex and gender are not binary, right. Associated Press. The AP ruling the AP ruling it isn't, so doesn't change science. It's a premeditative attempt to change culture and policy. It's activism, obviously, not journalism. Right, activism and journalism is one thing, and it's not unsurprising or new. The sort of activism going on in science where you're unconcerned with the outcomes for your patients, particularly children, is breathtaking. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined again by Libby Emmons. She's a contributor to Spectator USA, the aforementioned Quillette, as well as the American Conservative. Libby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have written a couple of pieces recently in this whole topic area, and you've focused, among other areas, on sports. And again, we have example after example. They're becoming more numerous of men interceding into women's sports and displacing women.
Yeah, it's really starting to be a problem. And one of the problems with it is that there is no cohesive policy in the U.S. Certainly at a federal level, there's nothing. Every state is kind of on its own to trying to figure this out, and they're all making different decisions as to what the right thing to do is. Some states are even not making a decision at a state level, but letting it just go to each locality to figure out what they should do about it. And the problem with that is, excuse me, the problem with that is that, men and women have differences. And when we just leave it up to people to determine it by themselves, we're asking them to make a choice between their feelings of compassion for people who have gender dysphoria and, absolute normal sense. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, that's really it.
Well, and so I guess the question is, do moms and dads want so many of their daughters collectively to be able to participate in sports at the K through 12, even collegiate level, or are they going to sit idly by and watch guys come in and replace the spots that perhaps their daughter should have?
The case in Connecticut there were two track competitors who were trans. They were male to female, and they've been winning all the titles. And some of the girls there and their parents have taken a lawsuit to try and get that overturned, try and get their spots back. And the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is interrogating that as well and has launched an investigation into Connecticut sports to try and see what's going on, that these girls are going to be denied scholarships because they come in fifth and sixth as opposed to, second and third or whatever it is.
Do you think we'll ever see a time where we'll have men competing, women competing, and then a transgender group?
I don't know that makes any sense, because who would be in the transgender group? Would we have female-bodied persons who are presenting as men competing against male-bodied persons presenting as female? What we see in rugby, for example, in the UK, is that when male-bodied persons join the women's rugby team, women competitors get brutally injured.
Oh, yeah.
I think the term was, one of the refs said that he was watching women get folded like deck chairs out on the field. Rugby is horribly brutal. It's more brutal than football. They don't even have pads. They don't wear helmets. And refs were quitting because they just couldn't stand to watch these injuries. I think some of those, there have been injuries also, I think, in roller derby, where male-bodied persons who are presenting as female are checking women against the walls, and women are just going down, and getting destroyed. One thing I think also that's pretty clear is we're not seeing trans men, women who are presenting as men, competing at high levels of male sport. We just don't see that. I did significant research for a piece that I recently ran in the American Conservative about this, where I was kind of just trying to figure out what is going on, what are all of these examples. And for women who transition and then go on to play sports, they end up making a name for themselves by doing the talk show circuit, but certainly not through championships. That just doesn't happen. Also, the first trans man to play NCAA basketball played for the women's team. Why? Because she was a woman, and she wasn't going to play, I think it was George Washington, she wasn't going to play on GW's men's NAAC, NAA, whatever.
Well, right.
And it's not going to happen. She's not going to hit that level.
And that's not even the point, right? I mean, the point is to say, no, the world has to recognize me and afford me the opportunities based on how I identify. I mean,
It's
that's
called
the whole
cheating.
That's the whole point. I mean,
Right.
they don't want to be they don't want to be separated and have like a trans team. They want to be fully assimilated. And
Right.
and here's this Colonel Jennifer Pritzker here in Chicago wrote this op-ed in the Chicago Tribune the other week, and he transitioned to a she. And what Colonel Pritzker said, and he was mostly talking about the Republican Party to which she affiliates, the party continues to champion policies that marginalize me out of existence, define me as an eccentric character. And so he's questioning his continued allegiance to the Republican Party, or her continued allegiance to the Republican Party. But But the you can. It seems to me this is sort of the Mau-Mauing language that backs so many people down. You're marginalizing me. I'm not marginalizing you. You can identify however you want. You can live your life however you want. So as long as you don't impinge upon others to do the same, and that impinging upon others to do the same, it's actually you that's the moving party to impinge upon that's impinging upon others to do the same, and it's you who is using government to impose your will when it comes to bathroom and locker room policy, or when it comes to sports, or even when it comes to oh my gosh, medical treatment of minors. I don't think that's been sort of more forcefully argued,
I don't think
as
so
well
either.
as much
And I
as it
think
should be.
Yeah, and I think the medical mistreatment of minors, because let's call it what it is, it's complete mistreatment to take a perfectly healthy young girl who's never had a sexual experience, remove her breast, remove her reproductive organs, and capitulate to this idea that she's really male just because she doesn't want to grow up into a woman, which, let's face it, growing up into a woman, especially at that age when you're hitting puberty and everything, you know what? It's a disaster. You know, it's like just watch the life cycle of anything. It's a horrible situation. So you're taking these girls who have no experience of their bodies, and we're telling them that they're really boys. And the reason that we're doing this, and we're doing the same thing to young boys, except I think that the surgical interventions that are being done with young girls are far more irreversible.
Oh, yeah.
Typically, young boys at that age, they're not going to be castrated. This has happened. You know, there was Susie Green's son. She took him to Vietnam on I believe it was Thailand, 16th birthday to have him castrated. So that's such a great birthday present. She's the head of mermaids in the UK. But what happens, but for most young boys, that's not the first step, right? That's just not the first step.
Right.
But with young girls, they take their breasts off pretty much right away. That's irreversible. Even if you're a young boy and you get breast implants, you can get those.
Removed.
You can get silicone breast implants removed.
Right.
Your development is going to be stunted by puberty blockers, and you're not going to get that growth back. You know, in terms of like genital development. But for girls to have this stuff done to them is just brutalizing. I mean, I couldn't imagine. And there's so many detransitioners, young women in their 20s. And the reason I think that this is going on, and it's being pushed so forcefully, is because the most vocal people in this movement are middle-aged men with these life crises where they want to feel themselves up. So in order to justify their, midlife crisis fetish, they need to say that they were always this way, because the only way that they can adapt to the language of mistreatment and all of that kind of stuff, the only way they can adapt that language is by saying they were always this way. Well, and the reason they hadn't transitioned is
can't they just buy a sports car like buy a sports car like everybody else?
Yeah. Well, back to some teenagers.
Just get divorced. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, that's bad enough without completely destroying your body and society at large.
Don't you blame, too, the doctors? I mean, I know someone who was in high school. She's transitioning into a he and has been wearing, like, a bandeau to keep the breast down. But the doctor stepped in and said, she's having a hard time breathing. Her lung capacity is at risk here. We need to do a double mastectomy. So I think that the doctors, too, are to, I mean, do they make money off of this? I mean, they even have, a transgender unit now at Northwestern Memorial Hospital.
They're
psychiatrists and psychologists and surgeons.
They're ideologues.
And they're using these terms like pregnant person, menstruator, and then complaining when women say that a woman is a biological reality. What is this? The thing that I'm worried about, and I was recently on a panel here in New York with the Women's Liberation Front and Posey Parker, who was talking about, she's worried that this that we're done, that we've lost, that this is never going to reverse. And that's something that I'm sort of starting to be afraid of as well. This, a lot of us keep talking about this. We get shouted down. We keep talking about it. Women lose their jobs. Women lose their friends. They, get yelled at by teachers and doctors. They lose their kids because ACS steps in when you don't just go along with your 14-year-old daughter having a hysterectomy. And society just keeps pushing along government keeps enacting these laws. I think New Hampshire just passed a bill that said, sure, boys can compete in girls' sports. The IOC is going to allow trans women to compete in women's sports in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. And all they have to do, and this is interesting too, because it's doping, right? They have to be on estrogen for a year. They have to get their testosterone down to, I think the maximum is 10 nanomoles per liter of blood, which for a woman to try and get up to 10 nanomoles, it's like a decade of testosterone still isn't going to get her there.
Well, also, too,
So what is it?
Also, too, the science is pretty clear on this. There's a study by a journal of endocrinology that it doesn't matter that you still have men retain the muscle and strength advantage even if you adjust testosterone levels. I mean, just the structure of the body, they still maintain a huge strength and thus competitive advantage in most sports.
Yeah, of course they do. And their ability to build muscle mass is still far increased than women. And their hips aren't further apart. They have all the advantages. And it's absurd to think otherwise. It's just crazy. But I don't know. I don't know how we're going to reverse it. There's a bill up in Colorado right now to make medical transitioning of minors a felony. So we'll see what happens with that.
All that it takes for evil to succeed is for good men and women to do nothing, and that's sort of what we have happening here, it seems to me. Libby,
I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, Libby Emmons, contributor to Spectator USA, Quillette, and the American Conservative. Libby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.